There's a kind of silence that only exists on open land, not the silence of empty rooms or quiet streets. It's bigger than that. It presses against you. It listens back. Elias Cutter had been riding that silence for 31 years. He knew every creak of it, the way wind moved through dry grass like something breathing, the way a hawk's shadow crossed red dirt without a sound. He thought he understood the land. He thought he understood what lived on it. He was wrong about both. What happened in the summer of 1887 didn't start with a gunshot or a flood or any of the catastrophes men tend to write down and pass around. It started with a dog. The biggest dog anyone in Hartwell County had ever seen, an animal so enormous people had stopped arguing about what it was and just started calling it the thing. Farmers locked their chickens in. Mothers pulled their children inside. The sheriff put a bounty on it after it dragged a calf halfway across the Delacroix property line. Elias Cutter was the man they sent to deal with it. He found the animal, he raised his rifle, and then the dog begged him for help. Not in any way a man could easily explain, no human words, no trick of the light. But something passed between them in that moment that Elias would spend the rest of his life trying to put into language. He set his rifle down. He followed the animal instead. What he found at the end of that trail didn't just change what he thought about dogs, or about wilderness, or about the Jicarilla Apache family camped in the canyon 3 miles from town that nobody wanted to acknowledge existed. It changed what he thought about himself. This is the story Elias Cutter wrote down in the back of his leather log, not for anyone else to read, not for publication or legacy. He wrote it because some things are too heavy to carry without setting them somewhere first. What you're about to read is the truth, as close as one man could get to it. Don't look away from the hard parts. That's where the story lives. I have kept one since I was 19 years old when my Uncle Reeve pressed a flat, square book into my hands the morning I left his place for good and said, "Write down what you see, Eli. Memory is a liar and men are worse." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I do now. The log is not a diary. I want to be clear about that. I have no patience for the kind of writing where a man describes his feelings like he's reading them off a label. What I record are facts. Temperatures, distances, names, which direction a thing moved, what tracks looked like, what the sky was doing. My uncle was right that memory lies. I found it lies most convincingly about exactly the things you most want to remember a certain way. So when I tell you what happened in the summer of 1887, I'm not pulling it from memory alone. I have the log. I have 41 pages of it covering 19 days between the 10th of June and the 28th, written in pencil in my right hand that keeps cramping worse than it used to. Some of the entries are short, 3 lines, 4. Some run for pages. The entry for June 17th takes up 11 pages and ends in the middle of a sentence that I never finished, because by the time I came back to the log that night, I no longer trusted the words I'd been planning to write. That's where I'll start, not at the beginning of the 19 days, but at the 17th, because that's where the shape of the whole thing becomes visible. I'll fill in the before and the after as best I can without dressing it up more than it deserves. I had been tracking the animal for 4 days when I finally got a real look at it. 4 days sounds like a short time. It wasn't. The valley between the Castillo ridgeline and the dry bed of Arroyo Muerto is roughly 11 miles end to end and varies between 2 and 4 miles wide, and the animal had been moving through it like smoke, leaving sign everywhere and appearing nowhere. I'd found tracks. I'd found scat. I'd found the remains of what appeared to be a mule deer, taken cleanly at the neck in a manner I couldn't quite account for because the kill site showed no signs of a chase. Whatever had taken the deer had done it either from ambush or in a single, impossibly fast rush across open ground. Those tracks, though, that's what I kept coming back to. I've tracked wolf, cougar, bear, coyote, lynx, and every domestic animal that ever went feral in this part of New Mexico. I have tracked a bobcat for 8 miles through pine forest based on nothing but the ghost of its weight pressed into dry needles. I know what I'm looking at when I look at a print. These prints said dog. The shape, the gait, the way the rear pads struck slightly inside the front, dog. But the size was wrong by an order that made me keep crouching and putting my hand flat in the dirt beside the impressions to confirm what I was seeing. My hand is not a small hand. My palm fit inside one of those prints with room on all sides. Sheriff Aldous Prout had described the animal to me before I rode out. He is not a man given to exaggeration. Prout is the sort who deflates things on principle, as a kind of personal habit, because he grew up among people who inflated everything and it left a mark on him. So when Prout told me the thing was big, his voice carrying the particular flatness he reserves for facts he finds embarrassing, I calibrated upward. When he told me it had dragged a year-old calf approximately 40 feet across fenced pasture, I calibrated further. I had not calibrated far enough. I saw it first at approximately 6:30 in the morning on June 17th, when the light was still low and orange and everything in the valley was throwing a long shadow east. I was positioned on a shelf of rock about 12 feet above the valley floor, watching a draw where I'd found fresh tracks the evening before. My rifle was across my lap, a .45 570 that I'd carried for 11 years and trusted like a third hand. I had coffee in a tin cup that had gone cold 40 minutes earlier, and I was not yet willing to admit that I'd been awake since 3 in the morning for nothing. And then the animal stepped out of the shadow of the arroyo wall, and I stopped thinking about coffee entirely. My first thought, and I'm including this because honesty requires it, was that it was a horse. The height of it, the broad, muscled shoulders. Then my eyes adjusted to the way it moved, the four-legged gait, the tail carried low, and I thought, bear. Then it turned its head and looked directly at the draw below me, and I saw the long, broad face, the upright ears, the yellow-brown coat, and I understood it was a dog. A dog the size of a young pony. A dog that, standing in the early morning light with its ribs expanding and contracting in slow, visible breaths, looked for all the world like something that had been made from the same materials as a dog, but assembled at twice the recommended scale. I raised the rifle. This was what I'd been paid to do. Prout's bounty was $25, which was 3 months of what I cleared breaking horses for Terence Delacroix, and the county had already lost 2 calves and a great deal of community peace to this animal. I had no particular quarrel with the dog as a concept. I had a quarrel with waiting 4 days in cold early mornings, and I was prepared to resolve it. I had the animal in my sights. Steady, clean angle, 50 yards, maybe 55. It wasn't moving, it had stopped in the middle of the draw, still looking at something to the north that I couldn't see from my angle. I should have fired then, I know that. Any man reading this who's spent time hunting will understand that the shot you take is always better than the shot you deliberate over, because deliberation invites the world to interfere. The world interfered. The dog turned its head, not gradually, not as a function of some movement I'd made. I was stone still, downwind, invisible by every measure that should matter. It turned its head as if it had heard something that I hadn't, and it looked directly at me. Not in the direction of my position, not vaguely toward the ridgeline. At me. At my face, at my eyes, with an expression, and I am using that word deliberately, understanding how it sounds, with an expression that I can only describe as recognition. Like it had known I was there the entire time, and had simply been waiting to see if I'd announce myself. I had been looked at by animals before. Every person who works with livestock or tracks game has had that experience of an animal's gaze and the strange, momentary suspension it creates. This was not that. This was something that lasted 30 full seconds. I counted from habit, because counting things is what I do when I don't know what else to do. And during those 30 seconds, the dog did not look away, did not break the line of attention between us, did not show fear or aggression or any of the things I knew how to read and respond to. It showed something else, something I don't have a precise word for even now. Then it turned and walked north, into the deeper shadow of the arroyo. And instead of firing, instead of doing the thing I had been paid to do, the thing I had ridden 4 days for, the thing that was, by every reasonable measure, the correct and professional action, I climbed down off the rock and followed it. I wrote in the log that evening, followed the animal north approximately 3 miles, terrain poor, lost sight twice, recovered sign both times, animal not fleeing, animal moving at deliberate pace, checking behind itself at regular intervals, behavior unknown category. That last part, unknown category, is the kind of notation I almost never use. I have a stubborn streak about categories. My uncle used to say I'd find a box for the devil himself just so I could label it correctly. It bothered me to write those 2 words, which is part of why I wrote them. Accuracy matters more than comfort. That's the whole point of the log. What I didn't write in the log that evening was how I felt following the animal. I don't record feelings, but I'll record them here because this account is something different. I felt for the first 3/4 of a mile like a fool. A professional tracker ignoring a clean shot to follow a dog into rough terrain because it looked at him. I rehearsed various versions of explaining this to Sheriff Prout. None of them landed particularly well in the rehearsal. I considered more than once turning around. I kept walking. By the second mile, the foolishness had been replaced by something quieter and harder to name. The animal was doing something I'd never seen a wild or feral dog do, which was lead. Not in the way a trained dog leads, not with the eager, bouncing urgency of an animal that knows where the treat is hidden. It moved the way I imagined a guide might move, purposefully, unhurried, but always checking, pausing on high ground to look back, waiting when I fell behind in a rough section of terrain. Once, when I went the wrong way around a berm of loose shale and lost several minutes, it doubled back to where I'd gone wrong and stood there until I corrected myself. The thought that arrived, and that I pushed away several times before I finally let it settle, was, this animal needs something. And it has decided you are the one to provide it. The third mile was harder. The arroyo narrowed and the walls rose, throwing shade, and the footing turned from dirt to broken rock, and then to packed clay that held water from the last rain in low pockets. I was sweating through my shirt despite the shade. My right knee, which I'd wrecked on a bad landing 5 years earlier and which I have been managing with varying degrees of success ever since, was making itself known with the particular sharp commentary it reserves for descents and uneven terrain. The dog moved through the same ground without apparent difficulty. Watching it navigate the broken rock, the fluid, unhurried precision of it, the way it chose each placement without seeming to think about the choice, was the first time I felt something close to awe instead of just professional assessment. We came around a long bend in the arroyo, and the walls fell away on one side, and I stepped out into a canyon I hadn't known was there. I want to describe this carefully, because the way a place looks when you first see it stays with you differently than the way it looks after you've been in it a while, and the first look matters. The canyon was smaller than the word suggests, maybe 150 yards across at its widest, narrowing at both ends to gaps in the red rock wall. A spring ran along the eastern edge, thin but consistent, filling a shallow rock basin before spreading into the ground. There were cottonwoods along the spring line, old ones, their leaves making the particular dry whisper that cottonwood leaves make when air moves through them. The ground was level and relatively clear of the scrub growth that dominated the arroyo floor. There was a camp. Not an abandoned camp, not the remnants of someone long gone. A working camp, 2 structures of bent willow branch and hide, a fire ring with ash that still held heat when I crouched beside it later, a rack of drying meat set between 2 young cottonwood trunks, a stack of gourds near the spring, tools and bundles arranged with the kind of order that speaks to long habitation, to a relationship with a particular piece of ground. A camp made by people who intended to remain. The dog had stopped at the edge of the camp and was looking back at me. I stood at the mouth of the canyon for what felt like a long time, though I think it was probably closer to 2 minutes. I was not thinking clearly. I want to be honest about that. My head was processing information in a scattered, unsequenced way that I generally associate with moments of significant surprise, and what was coming through clearest was not analysis but pure sensation. The sound of the cottonwoods, the smell of wood ash and dried meat, the weight of my rifle, the pain in my right knee, and the absolute stillness of the camp itself. Because the camp was still, no one was moving. The dog walked to the entrance of the nearer structure, the larger of the 2, and lay down in front of it. Lay down with a deliberateness that read almost like a statement. I am here. I am staying. Now what will you do? I stood there for another minute, then I walked forward. I am going to describe what I found in that structure plainly, without softening it and without adding to it, because I think it deserves plainness. There was a child inside. A boy, I guessed around 5 or 6 years old, lying on a blanket woven in the red and black geometric pattern I'd seen on hickoria blankets sold in the trading post in Alameda, though those were thinner and poorer than this one. The boy was unconscious. His face was flushed in the manner of fever, the particular alarming flush that sits high on the cheeks and makes the rest of the face look almost gray by comparison. His breathing was audible from the entrance, a congested, effortful sound. There was a woman near him. She was sitting against the far wall of the structure in a position that told me before I saw her clearly that she was not sitting there by choice. Her left leg was extended in front of her at an angle that made my stomach turn. A snake bite, I would learn shortly, received 2 days prior when she had stepped on a diamondback in the rocks above the spring while gathering something she needed. The leg was swollen from the ankle to above the knee. The color was wrong. She had tied a strip of cloth around her lower thigh, and she had done everything else that could be done with what was available, which was not enough. She was looking at me. Her face was composed in the particular way of someone who has been in fear and pain for long enough that the outward expression of both has been worn smooth, leaving something underneath that is quieter and more complete than either. She was holding a piece of wood, a tool handle, a digging stick, something with weight and a good grip in her right hand, and she did not lower it when I came through the entrance, which told me something about her judgment and her character that I registered and respected immediately. I raised my hands. Not the rifle. I'd set the rifle against the canyon wall outside, which I had done without consciously deciding to. Just my hands, palms out, the universal shape of I am not the threat right now. She watched me for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't understand. I don't speak Hickory or Apache. At that point in my life I spoke English, the workable Spanish I'd picked up over 12 years in New Mexico, and approximately 40 words of Ute that a man named Kicking Stone had traded me for help with his wagon axle the previous autumn. I had nothing that would bridge the distance between us linguistically. I want to be clear about this because I've heard accounts of encounters between white settlers and Apache people in which communication is made to seem easier than it ever actually was, as if the desire to understand each other is sufficient to produce understanding. It isn't. Language is a tool, and when you don't have it, you work with what else is available. What was available was the child's breathing and the woman's leg, and the dog lying outside the entrance, and 41 years of reading situations that I couldn't fully explain in words. I looked at the boy, I looked at the woman, I looked at my hands and then back at her. Then I pointed at myself, pointed at the entrance, and made the most comprehensible gesture I could for I will go and I will come back. She watched me. Something shifted slightly in the arrangement of her face, not trust, not yet, not something with that much weight to it. Something smaller, the beginning of a calculation. She didn't lower the stick, but she let me leave. I ran the 3 miles back to where I'd left my horse, and then I rode 7 miles to the home of a man named Cornelius Webb, who was the closest thing Hartwell County had to a physician, and who would be the first to tell you, if he was being honest, that the closest thing is not the same as the thing. Webb had been a field surgeon during the war, which meant he knew how to work fast with poor materials under bad conditions, which was exactly the kind of knowledge the situation required. I will compress the next 4 hours considerably because what matters is not the logistics, but what they cost. Webb came. We rode back together in the late afternoon heat with Webb's bag and my pack, and a mule loaded with water and what supplies I could throw together quickly from his stores. We navigated the arroyo in the last of the daylight, which was harder going down than coming up. The dog was still in front of the structure when we arrived. Webb went into the structure while I stood outside, and felt the particular uselessness of a man who has done everything he can do, and arrived at the point where what is needed is something he cannot provide. Through the hide wall of the structure I could hear Webb's voice, low and steady, the voice of a man who has learned to make his voice into a kind of instrument of calm regardless of what he's actually feeling. I could hear, occasionally, a sound from the woman that I couldn't categorize precisely and didn't try to. I sat on the ground next to the dog. This is the part of the 17th that I recorded in 11 pages and never finished, and I want to try to finish it now. Sitting next to the dog, beside this enormous, improbable animal that had led me 3 miles through bad terrain to a canyon I hadn't known existed, that had laid itself across the entrance of a structure containing a sick child and an injured woman for what must have been at least 2 days, that had found me in the early morning light and held my gaze until I put my rifle down. Sitting beside this animal in the near dark with the cottonwoods making their dry whisper and the sound of Webb's voice coming through the wall, I had a thought that I have not been able to fully shake in the 39 years since. The thought was, we make so many assumptions about what can ask for help. We make so many assumptions about who is worth helping. I'm a man of practical habits and limited philosophy. I say that without apology. It served me well. But sitting in that canyon, I found myself examining every assumption I'd brought with me into that valley, what the animal was, what the people in that camp were, what the right response was to any of it. Prout's $25 was in my coat pocket. I had ridden 4 days for it, and what I had found was not a predator to be put down, but a guard that had run out of options. The dog put its enormous head on my knee and exhaled. I put my hand on its neck, felt the warmth of it, the slow, powerful pulse. And I sat there while Webb worked, and I let what I was learning about the dog, about the canyon, about the distance between what I'd assumed and what was true, settle into me at whatever pace it needed. Some things can't be rushed. This was one of them. Webb came out of the structure an hour after dark. He looked tired in the way that has nothing to do with physical effort and everything to do with the weight of the work. He sat down across from me and accepted the coffee I'd made while he worked, and he drank half of it before he said anything. "Child has fever," he said. "Lung congestion, probably from something he breathed in or an infection, hard to say. I've done what I can. He's young and he's otherwise strong, which is the best thing he has going for him." "The woman—" Webb looked at his cup. "The leg is bad. The venom spread further than I'd like. I've cleaned the site, drawn what I could, given her the root preparation. She had her own, better than mine, honestly. She knew what to do, she just didn't have enough of it, and she couldn't walk to get more." "Will she keep the leg?" He looked at me for a long moment. Probably yes. Probably. I wrote it in the log later with a period after it, which is how I record things I am not going to interrogate further because the interrogation won't change anything. "There's no husband," Webb said. "No one else in the camp. I don't know if there was someone and they're gone, or if there wasn't someone to begin with. She didn't tell me anything except what she needed me to know to help her, which, frankly, was enough." I looked at the entrance of the structure. In the dark, the dog was a shape against the darker shape of the hide wall. "She had a name for the dog," Webb said unexpectedly. "Said it with her hand on its side when I came back in. Said it twice, the same word. I don't know what it means." "Did she say it like it was her dog?" Webb thought about this. "She said it like it was its own dog that happened to be there. That's the best I can describe it." I looked at the animal. The animal looked at me. Unknown category, I thought. Still, probably permanently. "We stayed the night. I don't mean we planned to, we simply didn't leave, and at some point the decision was made by default, the way important decisions often are." Webb slept against his mule with the particular talent of a man who has learned to sleep anywhere when he can. I sat by the fire and wrote in the log until the pencil went dull and I couldn't be bothered to find another. The child's breathing changed around 2 in the morning. I heard it through the wall, a slight, tentative clearing, a loosening in the congested sound. I stopped writing and listened for a long time, long enough to be sure I was hearing what I thought I was hearing and not just what I wanted to hear. I wrote in the log, 2:14 a.m. Boy's breathing improved, reason unknown. Then I wrote, dog has not moved from entrance. Has not eaten anything since my arrival that I have seen. Then I sat for a long time without writing anything. There was a moon. The canyon walls were pale in it, and the cottonwoods were silver, and somewhere up on the rim a nighthawk was making its high, thin sound. The spring was moving, a small, persisting sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I had come here to kill something. I was sitting in its canyon, watching it guard the people it had decided were worth guarding, listening to a child breathe easier in the dark. I did not know what to do with that. I still don't entirely. But I wrote it down, because that's what I do, and because I knew, even sitting there in the middle of it, that I would need the record later when memory tried to make the story simpler than it was. Memory does that, my uncle warned me. He was right. I left the canyon on the morning of June 18th with the intention of returning. That sentence looks simpler than it was. Before I left, I stood outside the structure in the early light, and I had a conversation with myself that I am not going to transcribe in full because parts of it were not flattering. The gist of it was this. I was a man who had been hired to kill an animal that turned out to be a sentinel. I was a man who had found, following that animal, a situation that no reasonable interpretation of my assignment covered. I was a man with $25 in my coat pocket that I had not, technically, earned, and with a set of obligations. To Sheriff Prout, to Terrence Delacroix, to the Hartwell County community that had engaged me. That did not include camping in a hidden canyon, and making myself responsible for 2 people whose language I didn't speak. The counter-argument, which arrived with less volume but more persistence, was that I had already stayed 1 night, Webb had already treated the woman's leg and the child's fever, and walking away now was a particular kind of action that would look like a non-action from the outside, but was not. I'd been in the territory long enough to know how Apache families in isolated camps tended to fare when discovered by people who were not, primarily, interested in their welfare. The thought of going back to Prout, reporting the animal neutralized and the bounty collected, and leaving the canyon unmentioned, that thought sat in my chest like a swallowed coal. Webb had decided the night before without much deliberation. "I'll come back tomorrow," he'd said, packing his bag. "The leg needs watching. Don't argue with me, Eli. I didn't argue with you when you wanted to follow a horse-sized dog into a canyon." So it wasn't just me. I rode back to town, returned Prout's $25, which produced a reaction from Prout I'll describe as geologically still, in the way that mountains are still, and told him the animal was gone. Not dead. Gone, moved on. I said it with the particular flatness Prout himself uses for embarrassing facts, and he looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "Gone where?" "Don't know," I said. "Tracked it to the edge of the county, didn't follow further." This was a lie. It was not a comfortable lie. I am not a natural liar, which is part of why I keep a log, because precision about facts is how I stay honest with myself. But it was a lie I made a deliberate choice to tell, and I recorded it in the log that night with the date and time and the full context, because if I'm going to lie, I am at least going to own it on paper. Prout studied me. His face did the thing it does when he suspects something is not being told to him, a slight contraction around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw. He is not a stupid man. He has the instincts of someone who has spent 20 years sorting what people say from what they mean. "All right," he said eventually. "You'll let me know if it comes back." "I will," I said. That part wasn't a lie. I rode out the same afternoon. The second week in that canyon is what I want to write about now, and I'm going to write it the way it happened, not in the compressed summary form I used to describe the first day. It deserves more than compression. Some things do. Her name, as best as I could transliterate it into the log, was something close to Dalii, though I understood later, through a process I'll describe, that this was a shortened form used in certain contexts, and that the full form was longer and carried layers of meaning I didn't have the framework to understand. I'll call her Dalii here because that's how she said it when she finally said it to me, pointing at herself on the fourth day, in the flat, declarative manner of someone giving you the minimum necessary information and waiting to see what you do with it. The boy's name I never heard. She didn't give it, and I didn't press for it. I understood, slowly and through observation rather than explanation, that there were contexts in which names were not simply handed out, that they had weight and occasion, and that you didn't offer them to someone you weren't yet sure about. This made a kind of sense to me that I couldn't have fully articulated, but that felt true in the same way the log felt true. Names matter. You give them carefully. I called the boy El Niño in my own head, in the limited Spanish that my brain sometimes defaults to in emotionally complex situations for reasons I've never fully understood. He was, by the fourth day, sitting up. By the fifth he was outside the structure, though close to it, watching me with an expression of total, unembarrassed assessment that I found both disconcerting and admirable. Children have a directness that adults spend most of their lives training themselves out of. I missed it, watching him, missed some simpler version of myself that hadn't yet learned to look sideways at things. The dog was named, as near as I could determine, something I transcribed in the log as CA, a word that Webb told me later, when he was able to have a longer conversation with Dalii through a combination of Dalii's limited Spanish and Webb's Dalii's better sign vocabulary, meant something in the neighborhood of rock or stone. This struck me as an understatement of the first order, and also as exactly right. The animal had the quality of something fixed and permanent, something that had been placed there rather than arrived. CA had, by the second day of my return, accepted me with a completeness that felt less like friendship and more like professional acknowledgement. I was doing something useful. The animal understood useful. It watched me with the same unnerving calm it had shown in the arroyo on the morning I hadn't shot it, and sometimes it moved close enough that its shoulder pressed against my leg, and I took this for what it was. Not affection, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The work of those days was practical, and it was hard, and it was, in the way that genuinely hard practical work often is, good for me. I gathered wood. I managed the fire, which needed constant attention because the canyon's narrowness, and the way the wind moved through it created unpredictable drafts that could kill a fire or surge it, and either extreme was a problem. I hunted twice in the first week, once successfully, coming back with a mule deer that I field-dressed and brought into camp and presented to Dalii with the kind of careful neutrality you'd use to place something on a table that you're not sure belongs to you. She inspected it. She said something I didn't understand. Then she began to work with it with a competence and efficiency that made me feel both respectful and entirely decorative. She was not helpless. I want to be very direct about this because I think it's the most important thing I can say about her. She had been rendered by injury, unable to do certain things that she needed to do, walk the terrain above the spring, carry weight, perform the hunting and gathering work that was normally hers to do. That incapacity was situational and temporary, not fundamental. Everything else she continued to manage with the calm, unhurried mastery of someone who has been doing this work their entire life and has never needed to be supervised or appreciated for it. Watching her working alongside her, when she allowed it, which was not immediately but built gradually over the days, was one of the more quietly significant educational experiences of my life. She had an approach to the materials she worked with, the camp, the spring, the plants along the spring line, the hides and tools and gourds and bundles that she organized and managed with a precision that made my log-keeping look loose by comparison. Everything had a place and a purpose and a relationship to everything else, and she moved through that web of relationships with the unself-conscious fluency of someone who has never separated herself from the work. I did not have a word for what I was watching. I still don't, quite. The closest I've come is mastery, but mastery sounds like something achieved, and what I was watching felt less like achievement than like nature. The same kind of natural that the cottonwoods were natural, that the spring was natural, that CA's movement through the terrain was natural. Just things being precisely what they were. I found this difficult to be around, initially. Not because of anything she did, but because of what her presence asked of me. Here is the part I'm going to write carefully. On the 6th day, Webb came back as he'd said he would, and Daliai's leg was better than he'd expected and worse than he'd hoped. And the three of us, with Webb serving as something like a translator between two inadequate vocabularies and a limited set of shared reference points, managed our first real conversation. It was slow, it was full of gaps. It was also one of the most honest conversations I have ever been part of, precisely because none of us had the luxury of saying more than we could actually mean. When you're working with 30 words and a set of gestures, you strip everything down to what matters. What I learned in pieces over the course of that afternoon. Dalii and her son had been in the canyon for 3 months, not passing through, staying. The canyon was known to her family, had been used by them for longer than she could specify in the vocabulary available to us. The spring was reliable. The hunting ground above the ridgeline was good. She had reasons I didn't fully understand for being there alone. Something had happened, some disruption to the larger group she was part of, some distance traveled and decision made. She gave me the outline and not the content, which I respected. The content was not mine to have unless she decided differently. CA had been with her for, as near as I could determine, 2 years. He was not, she indicated, a dog in the sense I understood the word. He was something else, something that had been present in her family's history, in a way that involved stories I was not going to be told that afternoon in a canyon in New Mexico with 30 shared words between us. She had found him, or he had found her, when he was young enough to need feeding and she had fed him, and after that there had been an arrangement that was apparently self-explanatory from her perspective. The morning I had come, the morning I had followed CA 3 miles through the arroyo she had sent him. I asked Webb to ask her how. He spent several minutes on the question, trying various combinations of word and gesture, and eventually came back to me with an answer that I've carried with me ever since. She says she asked him to find someone who would come, Webb said. I looked at her. She was watching me with the composed, assessing expression I was beginning to recognize as her default mode, a look that gave nothing away while taking everything in. And he found me, I said, not quite a question. Webb asked. Dalii listened, then looked at me directly and said something short and deliberate, and Webb translated. He found someone who would come. Not me specifically, someone. The dog had gone looking for a person who would follow, and I was the one who had followed. I sat with that for a while. I'm still sitting with it in some ways. The hardest thing happened on day 9. I had been back to town twice by then, once for supplies, once to pick up a package Webb had ordered that included certain materials he wanted for Dahlia's leg. Each time I went, I felt the town differently than I had before. Not dramatically differently, not in a way that anyone would have noticed from the outside. But internally, the way the town fit in my understanding of the world had shifted in some way I couldn't precisely identify. On day 9, I was in the canyon when 3 riders came into it. I heard them before I saw them, and what I heard first was the way the horses were moving, at a pace that told me the riders weren't exploring, weren't hunting, weren't passing through. They were coming somewhere. I was at the spring when they arrived, and I had a moment, very brief, where I saw the situation from both sides at once. 3 white men on horses, entering a canyon that contained a camp, a woman, a child, and me. I knew 2 of them. The third was a stranger to me, but not to the territory. He had the look of a man hired for a specific kind of work, which is a look I recognize with unpleasant accuracy. The one I knew better was a man named Cowboy, who worked for a ranching concern that had been pushing east from the Castillo Range for 2 years. He nodded at me with the cordiality of a man who is not feeling cordial, but is maintaining the form of it. "Cutter," he said. "Cowboy, didn't know you were out here." "Well," I said, "now you do." The situation had a particular shape that I had a few seconds to read and make a decision about. Cowboy was looking past me at the camp. The hired man was looking at the camp with a different kind of attention. The second man I knew, a younger fellow named Deese, who I'd worked with briefly on a fencing job the previous spring, was looking at his saddle horn. What I knew about Calloway's employers: they wanted water access, specifically spring water, because the range they were working was marginal without it. What I knew about the canyon: it had a spring. What I knew about Dahlia's presence in the canyon: it was 3 months old and it predated Calloway's people's interest in the area by at least 2 years. None of which was going to matter to Calloway's employers. I made a decision. I am going to write it plainly, and I am going to tell you that I've second-guessed it many times, and that the second guessing has never produced a version of the decision that I feel better about. I lied again, bigger this time. I told Calloway that the canyon was under a prior claim that was being processed through the county land office, that I had been hired to survey it and establish its boundaries, and that any access beyond the current point would constitute a violation of the claim process. I said this with the confidence of a man who actually knows what he's talking about, which I was not, and I held Calloway's gaze through the whole of it. Calloway looked at me for a long time. He looked at the camp. He looked at the dog, who had come to stand beside me with the quiet, absolute stillness that I had come to understand was the way CA communicated that he was ready for whatever came next. "Who filed the claim?" Calloway asked. "Information's with the county recorder," I said. "You can verify it there." Which of course he could and would find nothing, because there was no claim. I was buying time, and I knew I was buying time, and I knew that what I did with that time was going to determine whether the time was worth buying. Calloway looked at Deese. Deese looked at his saddle horn. The hired man looked at me with the particular, flat attention of someone who has been hired to look at things until someone tells him to stop looking. "We'll be back," Calloway said. "I'll be here," I said. They rode out. I stood at the canyon entrance until I couldn't hear the horses anymore, and then I stood there a while longer, feeling the weight of what I'd done and what I'd committed to by doing it. When I turned around, Dahlia was standing near the structure, watching me. She had been watching the whole thing. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was thinking, a slight focus around the eyes, an almost imperceptible set to her jaw. She said one word. It might have been a question. The intonation was not one I could read clearly. I shook my head, not in denial but in something closer to acknowledgement. I don't know yet what I've just started, but I've started it. CA pressed against my leg. The cottonwoods made their dry sound. I walked back to the spring and sat down and opened the log and wrote, Day 9. Calloway and 2 others, bought time, don't know how much. Then I sat for a long time without writing anything, listening to the spring, trying to think. That night I built the fire up higher than usual, and I sat beside it, and I thought about what I actually owed people and why. This is the kind of thinking I generally avoid, because it doesn't have the satisfying resolution of practical problems. You can't finish it and move on. But the canyon had a way of requiring it, Something about the walls and the spring and the particular quality of the silence there pushed back at whatever you were trying to not think about. I had grown up in a world with a very specific set of ideas about who mattered and how much and in what order. Most men of my background and generation had. These ideas were not examined. They were simply present, the way furniture is present, the way you don't think about a chair you've sat in your whole life until someone points out that it's broken. I don't say this to excuse anything. I say it because it's accurate. The canyon was pointing at the chair. Dallii mattered. Her son mattered. The claim on the spring, the history of the camp, the arrangement between them and this particular piece of ground, all of it mattered. Not in a way that required me to understand all of it or to be able to explain it in the language available to me, but in the way that a thing can matter simply because it's real, because it has weight and duration, and because its ending or continuation would change something irreversible in the world. I had been hired to kill a dog. The dog had led me here. And now I was here, and the question of what I was going to do about Calloway and his employers was not a question I could answer from the outside. Not from the town, not from Prute's office, not from any position that let me keep a comfortable distance between myself and the thing that was happening. The fire moved. Somewhere above the canyon rim, the nighthawk was back. I put the log away. I didn't sleep until nearly dawn. And when I did sleep, I dreamed about my Uncle Reeve telling me to write down what I saw. And in the dream, I was trying to explain to him that what I was seeing didn't fit in the kind of log he'd given me, that it required a different kind of writing, something more capacious, something that could hold the spaces between the facts as well as the facts themselves. He said in the dream, "Then write it that way." I woke up with the first light, and the sound of the boy laughing at something the dog was doing near the spring. I lay there and listened to it for a moment before I got up. Then I got up, and I went to find Webb, and I started trying to figure out what we were actually going to do. There's a thing that happens in situations of sustained pressure, situations that go on long enough that you stop being reactive and start having to be deliberate. The fear doesn't leave, but it moves. It settles lower in the body, becomes part of the baseline, and you find yourself able to think above it rather than through it. This is not bravery, whatever bravery is. It's more like adaptation, like the way your eyes adjust to low light. Not because you chose to see better, but because the darkness required it. By day 11, I was operating in that mode. Webb and I had talked for most of a morning, in his back room, with his door closed and his hound asleep against the wall in the manner of a dog that has decided the best response to human urgency is a full-body commitment to unconsciousness. Webb had the quality of a man who thinks while he listens, who processes things laterally, who will arrive at a position through a route that doesn't look like deliberation but turns out to have been. By the time we were done talking, we had the outline of something. The outline was not elegant, it was not without risk. It required Webb to call in a favor he'd been holding for 8 years from a man named Orseth who worked in the county land office, and who owed Webb the kind of debt that accumulates when a man loses a child to fever, and the doctor stays for 3 days straight without sleep and doesn't present a bill. It required me to go back to Calloway's employers, not Calloway himself, but the men above him, a partnership out of Santa Fe that had its fingers in 6 different land operations across the territory, and present a document that was not falsified but that was, let's say, strategically composed to suggest implications it didn't explicitly state. What we were doing, if I had to reduce it to a phrase, was making the canyon less convenient. Not legally protected, we didn't have the machinery for that, and the machinery that existed was not, in 1887, reliably disposed toward the outcome we were trying to achieve. What we were doing was making the acquisition of the canyon complicated enough, uncertain enough, that the calculation of what it would cost versus what the spring was worth would tip the wrong direction. We were buying time again, but this time we were trying to buy the permanent kind. I won't pretend I was confident. I'll say that I was moving, which is different. I went back to the canyon on day 12 with the document from Orseth, which bore an official county recorder's stamp and contained language about competing claims and unresolved survey boundaries that was true in every word while creating an impression that exceeded the sum of those words, and with a sense of what the next few days were going to require. Dallii was sitting outside the structure when I arrived. The boy was with her, leaning against her side with the boneless relaxation of a child who has been sick and is now recovering. A recovery that is still close enough to the illness that he hasn't quite returned to his full kinetic self, that he's still willing to lean and be still. She was working with her hands, something with dried plant material and a woven form that I couldn't identify the purpose of and didn't ask about. She looked up when I came through the canyon entrance. Tseye was beside her, and he lifted his head and then put it back down in the way that meant he'd registered my arrival and found it adequate. I sat down across from her, not too close, at the distance that 11 days of developing calibration had taught me she was comfortable with. I put Orseth's document in front of me. I thought about how to begin explaining it with no shared language, and then I thought about how I would feel if someone sat across from me and tried to explain something complicated in a language I didn't know, and I stopped trying to plan the explanation and just started. It took a long time. It involved Webb's hand-signed vocabulary, which I'd been practicing, and the 30 words we shared, and a fair amount of drawing in the dirt between us, and at several points I had the strong sensation that I was explaining less than I thought I was. But I watched the whole thing with the focused, patient attention of someone who understands that incomplete information, received carefully, is better than no information. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at me and said something longer than usual, a sentence, or what might have been 2 sentences joined, and I caught nothing of it. The boy straightened up from his lean against her and looked at me and said, in a small, deliberate voice, a single word that I had heard Webb use in his attempts at sign vocabulary. Stay. I looked at him. He looked back with the direct, uncomplicated assessment children bring to things. Stay, I said. He said it again. Then he looked at his mother, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that I didn't have the context to read, but that carried the particular weight of a thing being acknowledged. I didn't know then whether stay was a statement or a question or a request. I'm not sure I know now. I wrote it in the log that evening with a period after it, and didn't add anything else. I rode to the Castillo range operation the following morning. The men above Calloway were named Hartfield and Pruss. They operated out of a building in a small satellite settlement, 2 days north of Hartwell proper, and the building had the look of something that expected to become more permanent than it currently was, if things went the way they were hoping. A lot of buildings in the territory had that look in 1887. Some of them were right. Hartfield was the one I needed to talk to. Pruss was money. Hartfield was the working mind of the operation. He was not a villain in any satisfying sense. He was a competent, acquisitive businessman with a clear view of what he wanted and a practical approach to getting it. And the problem with people like that is that they're hard to argue with on the level of character, because the argument you need to make is about something below character, something about what the ground is for, and who it belongs to, and by what logic that belonging is established. These arguments have a long history and not a good one, and I knew when I rode up to Hartfield's building that I was not going to win anything with arguments. So I didn't argue. I gave him Orseth's document, and I watched him read it, and I watched the calculations moving in his face. The speed of them, the efficiency, the way certain numbers shifted in his evident internal accounting. Then I told him that I knew 3 additional individuals who had potential prior claims on the canyon watershed, all of which would require resolution before any development could proceed, and that the process of resolution in the current county recorder's office typically ran 14 to 18 months. This was also strategically true. There were 3 individuals. They had historical relationships with that part of the territory. Whether those relationships would survive legal scrutiny was an entirely different question, but the question was what mattered, not the answer. Hartfield needed certainty. Uncertainty was what I was selling. He looked at me with the flat, clear eyes of someone who knows he's being worked, and is deciding whether the working is skilled enough to respect. You've got an interest in this canyon, he said, not a question. I've got an interest in the accuracy of the information involved, I said, which is the same thing I was hired for. Survey work requires accuracy. He looked at Orseth's document again. He tapped it once, twice. 14 to 18 months, he said. At a minimum. He looked out the window at the range. The light on the grass was the flat, neutral light of midday, when everything is too bright to have shadows and the land looks two-dimensional. There's another spring, he said, not to me really, to himself or to some version of Pruss who was always present in his calculations. 30 miles east, less convenient, but... He stopped. I waited. "We'll release the survey request on the canyon," he said. "Redirect to the eastern approach." I kept my face where it was and said, "That sounds reasonable." I rode away from Hartfield's building at a walk, because a walk is what the situation required for the sake of credibility. And when I was far enough away that the building was small behind me, I let out a breath that I had apparently been holding for the last 20 minutes. Then I rode back to the canyon. I told Dahlia through the limited means available to us. I used the dirt drawing again, and the sign vocabulary and the 30 words, and at the end of it she sat very still for a moment, and then she said something quietly, not to me, almost under her breath, in the way of something directed upward or outward rather than at a person. I didn't ask what it meant. Some things are not for asking. What she said to me when she looked back from wherever she'd been for those few seconds was something I got roughly half of, something about the spring, something about the word I'd heard her use for permanence or continuation, something that included the word for stone. Tseye's name or the concept it contained. I thought about what Webb had told me. He found someone who would come. Stone, something that stays, something that doesn't move when the weather changes. I looked at the dog. He was lying in the shade of the east wall, his enormous flank rising and falling, his ears occasionally tracking sounds above the rim that I couldn't hear. He looked as he always looked, entirely unconcerned with whether any of this was possible, because possibility was not the category he operated in. He had sent himself into the territory, into the arroyo, into the early morning light. He had found me and held my gaze until I put my rifle down. He had led me 3 miles through bad terrain to a canyon I hadn't known existed. Whether that was instinct or something more, whether the animal understood what he was doing in the way a person understands what they're doing, or whether he was operating from some other kind of intelligence that arrived at the same place by a different route, I don't know. I've thought about it many times. I've had the conversation with Webb, who tends toward the practical explanation, and with Deese, years later, who drifted toward something closer to wonder. I've thought about it in the log and out of the log, and what I keep arriving at is that the distinction between the two might matter less than I initially thought. He did what needed to be done. The method was his own. Day 14. I want to write about this day separately from what surrounds it, because it had a different texture than the others, and I don't want that texture to get lost in the sequence. The boy's name, I learned it on day 14. He told me himself. He came and stood in front of me while I was working at the spring, clearing some rocks that had shifted and partly blocked the flow, and he stood there until I looked up, and when I looked up he said his name. It was longer than one sound, and I'm not going to write it here, because names carry weight, and I don't know who might read this and what they'd do with the weight. But he said it twice, and the second time he pointed at himself with the particular small-child emphasis of making absolutely sure you're getting the information. I told him mine, Elia's. He said it back, not quite right, the middle vowel softened in a way that made it sound like something else, and then he nodded, satisfied, as if this was a transaction he'd been waiting to complete. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. I sat at the spring for a while. There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves while they're happening. They don't feel significant. They just feel like a small exchange, a name given and received, the sound of a creek and the smell of cottonwood bark. And then later, sometimes much later, sometimes not until you're writing them down in a log or in something that used to be a log but has become something else, you understand that what felt like nothing was actually the whole point. I went back to clearing rocks. Day 17. I was getting ready to leave. This was not a sudden decision. It had been building across the days since Hartfield's operation stood down from the canyon, a gradual realization that the thing I had come to do, which had changed so many times from its original form that it bore almost no resemblance to the first version, had come to some kind of completion. Not an ending, I want to be precise about this. The canyon would continue. Dahlia and her son would continue. CA would continue. These were not endings in any sense. But the chapter of it that I was part of was done, and I knew the feeling of that the way I know the feeling of a job finished, not from some external signal, but from inside, from the way the situation stopped pulling on me with new demands and started resting. I spent the morning doing practical things, filling the water containers at the spring to a level they'd hold for several days, confirming the firewood stack, checking the dried meat supply and filling in what I could from a hunt the previous afternoon. Small, concrete acts. The kind that matter not because of their scale, but because of what they mean. I was here. I did what I could. I'm leaving something better than I found it. Or trying to. Dahlia watched. She was off the injured leg more now, still careful, still managing it with a deliberateness that told me it still hurt, but mobile. She'd been working toward a fuller range of function across the last week, with a quiet, determined consistency that I recognized as the same stubbornness that had kept her in that structure with her son. Leg swollen to twice its size, for 2 days before I arrived. In the late afternoon, she gave me something. I don't know what the correct way to describe this is. She brought it to me and held it out, a piece of worked leather, small, shaped and sewn with a pattern I couldn't decode but that I understood, in the way you sometimes understand things you don't have the vocabulary for. Was not decorative. It was precise. It meant something specific. The stitching was the kind of work that takes real time from a person who has real things to do with their time, and the fact of that time, of her choosing to put it into this thing, and then give the thing to me, arrived with a weight I was not fully prepared for. I held it, I looked at it, I looked at her. She said something that I believe, included the word for stone and the word for path or journey, and something I didn't know. She said it with the composed steadiness she brought to everything, the face that gave away nothing unnecessary, but with something underneath it that was not composed at all, that was in fact very present and very near the surface. The way still water over a fast current is still on the surface, but you can feel what's underneath if you put your hand in. I put it in my coat pocket. I could feel it there for the rest of the day. I said goodbye badly, the way people do when they don't have the words for what they're actually saying. I nodded at Dahlia. She nodded back, a slight, precise acknowledgement that carried more than its physical scale suggested. The boy, I'll call him by the first syllable of what he'd told me, a compromise between sharing and withholding, stood beside her and watched me with his direct, uncomplicated assessment. He didn't wave. He raised one hand briefly and then put it back at his side. I walked to where my horse was tethered at the far edge of the canyon. Ca walked with me. He stopped at a certain point, a natural demarcation, the edge of the camp area, beyond which the canyon floor changed character and the cottonwoods thinned. He stopped there and stood, and I stopped too, and we looked at each other for a moment that had the same quality as the first time in the arroyo in the early morning light, the same held attention, the same unhurried acknowledgement. I don't know what he saw when he looked at me. I know what I saw when I looked at him, the animal that had made a decision and acted on it and kept acting on it for as long as it needed acting on, without ceremony, without asking permission, without waiting for someone to tell him what was possible. I put my hand on his enormous head. He stood still, as he always stood, with the quality of rock. "All right," I said. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't information. It wasn't a command or a direction or anything that needed saying. It was just what arrived. He turned and walked back toward the camp. I untied my horse. I rode out. I have gone back to that canyon 4 times in the years since. The first time was 3 months later in October when I went to see if they were still there. They were. Dahlia's leg had healed well, the limp minimal. The boy was bigger. The dried meat rack was full. Ca had grown. I would not have thought it possible, but he had grown, and he acknowledged my arrival with the same professional calm as before, the same brief lift of the head. The second time was a year later. The camp was there, but they were not. I stayed a night, watched the fire, listened to the spring. Left in the morning. Wrote in the log, camp maintained but empty, unknown duration. Then, hope. The third and fourth times were spaced wider, 5 years apart than 8. The canyon was, both times, empty but intact. The cottonwoods were taller. The spring ran. I am writing this now in my 62nd year, which is later than I expected to arrive at and earlier than I'd prefer to leave from. My right knee has gotten worse. The log runs to several hundred pages now, bound in 3 different books after the first one filled. The piece of worked leather that Dahlia gave me on day 17 is in a wooden box on the table beside where I sleep. I have never found anyone who could tell me with certainty what the pattern means, though I've asked several people with more relevant knowledge than I have. The closest I've gotten is from a man named Altaha, who looked at it for a long time and said something like, "A record of a debt." When I asked him what debt, he said he didn't know. I've decided I don't need to know. Whatever debt she meant to record, The record of it is with me, and it's correct, and that's enough. What I know now that I didn't know in June of 1887. I know that the distance between what an animal can ask of you and what you think you're capable of offering is smaller than it looks. I know that the distance between what you assume about a person and what is actually true is larger than it looks. I know that the canyon was there before Calloway wanted it, and before Hartfield calculated it, and before I rode into the valley looking for something to kill. The canyon had its own history and its own inhabitants and its own logic, and all of us who arrived with our purposes and our $25 and our competing land claims were working on the surface of something much older and more patient than any of us. I know that CA understood the assignment before I did. He understood it before I arrived. He went to find someone who would come, and he found me, and what I did with that, what I was capable of doing with that, turned out to be more than I'd known I had. I don't think he was surprised. I don't think he was ever not sure it would work. He had that quality, that absolute unhurried conviction, right from the beginning, from that morning in the arroyo when he held my gaze until I made my choice. He looked at me the way you look at something you already know. I think about that. I think about it more as I get older and the log gets longer, and the people and animals and canyons I have encountered accumulate into something that starts to have shape and direction, though the shape and direction are not always the ones you planned. He found someone who would come, and then he went back to his work. I wrote that in the log. I wrote it late, years after, in one of the later books, and I put a period after it, and then I sat for a long time thinking about what it meant to be found. My uncle said memory is a liar. He was right, but some things, written down carefully enough, stay true. The spring runs, the cottonwoods grow. The canyon is there, patient and uninterested in being explained, doing what it has always done. I put the log away. I put the leather piece back in the box. I go to sleep,